Okay, so organizing your speech. Um, you want to organize your main ideas in a certain sequence, and it can be done topically. And by topically, I mean things based on a principle called primacy is one way you can do it. And the idea is that you put your strongest evidence, your strongest points first. And this is particularly helpful if your audience is unfamiliar with the subject or resistant to your ideas. So you hit them with your best shot first. But that's not the only way you can do it. You can also base it on something called recency. And the idea is that the most recent thing that people hear is what's going to stick with them. The last thing. So you focus on the last item. And you may want to do is build up, your evidence or your main points becoming stronger and stronger and stronger. And then at the end, that's the strongest one. What you don't want to do is to split the difference, where you take your strongest point and put it in the middle somewhere. Because anything in the middle is the most easily forgotten. So either put it first or put it last. Don't put it in the middle. I
Excuse me.
mean,
I have one question.
please.
For this particular part, like organizing your main ideas, what type of speech would this be? I mean, I know this would be in general for any speech, but specifically, which type of speech this would really pinpoint?
Well, this could be for an informational speech, or for a persuasive speech. I mean, you're trying to convince people of something. It might just be, academic, something informational, but this applies also if you're trying to persuade people. So thank you for that question. Good question. Another thing that you might need to take into account is complexity. Going from simple to complex. Think about how you learned math. First, you learned to count. Then you learned how to add, then subtract, then multiplication and division, then higher levels. There's no way you could start off with calculus. It's that kind of thing. I actually learned this painfully one time. I was asked to give a presentation on using spreadsheets to record grades. Most people at the time, most professors at the time, were still using grade books, the physical grade books with a pencil and pen and that sort of thing. And I developed a system, and I'm sure I'm not unique in this, of how to do it in spreadsheets. And I was asked in a faculty development day to make a presentation on this, actually a couple. And I started with my best spreadsheet. I was really proud of it, and it was really had all sorts of features that made it really useful. And it was just too complex for my audience, for the people who were not as Excel savvy as I was. So I had an afternoon session, so I reworked it, and I started with a very simple spreadsheet, and then I added a little bit of complexity and a little bit more and a little bit more. And even the people who lost me at the end still got something out of it. So so you don't want to start too complex. Go from simple to complex, the way we learn math. Okay. You can also organize things chronologically. If you're talking about some historical event or something, maybe it's the development of an institution or scientific progress, you can do it historically. Or if you're talking about steps in a procedure, how to get a driver's license or perform a specific operation. What you don't want to do is, okay, we're going to do step 1, step 2, step 3. Oh, but before you do step 3, you go back to something in step 2. So you have to keep everything chronological, otherwise people may lose you, or lose the sense of what they have to do. In some cases, and this is fairly rare, you might be able to organize things spatially. And like if you're explaining the campus, how trying to describe the campus, you don't jump all over the place. I saw a really good speech. I mean, it was on submarines one time, and the speaker, first off, I thought submarines are cool because you think about it, it's a ship that can sink and then still come up. So that's pretty cool. But he described how a submarine works, and he starts at the tail. He starts at the back end, talks about the propeller, the engine, how the engine is powered by a saltwater battery. You can actually use salt water to generate electricity, and that's what a lot of submarines do. And then the fresh water that results from that is then pumped into the water system of the submarine. And he started from the back and worked his way from, and I had even more respect for submarines than I ever had before. And he kind of moved along the way, along from the back to the front. And I thought that was really cool. And if he had jumped around at all, it wouldn't have been nearly as good. So you want to be organized in the way you present your ideas. So you can also present organized by cause and effect. One cause and many of the effects. For instance, somebody made a presentation talking about World War II, not so much the war itself, but the resulting after effects. For instance, after World War II, well, the State of Israel was established. There was also the Cold War. The going to the moon. Most people don't realize this, but the United States used a lot of former Nazi scientists to get to the moon. The big rocket was called the Saturn V, was actually designed by a man named Wernher von Braun, who was one of Hitler's rocket scientists. And also the effect that it had on women's rights, because if in World War II, the men went off to the battlefields, and women moved into factories, and they became building tanks and planes and jeeps and lots of other things. And if you may be familiar with the poster of Rosie the Riveter, and says, "Yes, we can." And when the war was over, the men came back. They wanted their jobs in the factories, but not all women just were content to go back being housewives. Many of them said, "No, I want a career too," and that was a major contributing factor to the women's rights movement. And so, one cause and so many effects. And so it was a great way to organize a speech. And you can also talk about some effect, some event, and all the causes that contributed to it. There was a speech a few years ago that I saw. It was about the housing and financial crisis we had roughly 10 years ago, and talked about how the contributing factors were, well, also one was the desire for a house. Everyone wanted a house, but also you had these mortgage agents who were just selling mortgages to people who really couldn't afford them. And then you also had on Wall Street something called these mortgage fraudulently constructed mortgage securities. They're like where they put a lot of crappy mortgages together and got a better rating for it. And then something else called credit default swaps. And all these together created a huge problem, the financial crisis. And so that was a great talk. It really made you understand the crisis. Organizing by problem and solution. You could talk about a problem and all the possible solutions. Now, the solutions may be alternatives, or the solutions may be applied at the same time. That's fine. Or you can talk about a solution and all the problems it solves. And I saw a woman give a wonderful speech about green energy. And she said, look at all the problems this would solve. First off, it would help alleviate global warming. And this old guy in the back got up and says, I don't believe this global warming. It's all a hoax and stuff. And she goes, that's okay, because it solves other problems too. It'll reduce pollution. It'll actually create jobs. And then she brought up one which I really didn't think about. It'll help undermine petrodictatorships. There are certain countries like Saudi Arabia and others that are essentially dictatorships, and they survived because of oil revenues. And her thesis was, if they could not survive on oil revenues, they'd start to have to start taxing their citizens, and if they tax their citizens, citizens will want to have a say in the government, and that would undermine their dictatorships and promote democracy. I'm not sure, but I thought those were very good ideas and a very well organized speech. So, and again, the same. I'm kind of repeating this diagram from a previous lecture. Normally, I give these lectures on different days, but since this is an accelerated long form class, you're going to see some duplication. When in dealing with supporting details, you're going to see some of the same principles: primacy and recency, which we just talked about, going from simple to complex, but also going from soft to hard evidence, and differentiating opinions from facts. Can anyone tell me the difference between an opinion and a fact?
A fact is verified almost, and an opinion is what you believe, how you feel, what you think.
Okay, close. I like the part of a fact is something you can verify. It's something you can test or measure, and that's important. An opinion may be correct, may be wrong. It's not based on anything verifiable. Like, for instance, I may say Governor Smith is a really bad governor. Well, how do you define bad? Is he a bad dresser? Is he irresponsible? Is he corrupt? What it's vague and something not you can't verify because it's not measurable. And so you want to be very careful. You want to lean towards facts as much as possible. And unfortunately, we're currently living in a society where fraud is rampant. You look at there are various quote news channels. They're not really news channels. They're propaganda channels, or others that are trying to do news, but they have certain biases. And you see this, by the way, throughout the political spectrum. I'm not pointing in any one direction. There's a lot of it in all the different directions. And so we need to reassert that facts matter, that evidence matters. And I would encourage you, when you give speeches, particularly persuasive speeches, or actually informational speeches as well, make sure you get the facts, you verify. And this is why I'm serious about having citations. I want those citations in your outlines, and I want you to connect every statement you make to that citation. I don't want just a list of citations at the end of the outline. Everything's got to be connected. I don't care if you use MLA or APA or Chicago Manual of Style or Style. I forget which, but I don't care as long as it's connected. So everything you say, you need to back up. And you can use illustrations, examples, expert testimony, hard statistics. Just be careful with hard statistics. There are ways that people lie with statistics, but also sometimes they make them confusing. And also don't hit people with too many numbers because it's hard for people to retain numbers. I can give you an example. Somebody tried playing around with statistics that this statistic I don't think is true anymore, but it certainly was in the past, that, for instance, 95% of all heroin addicts started with marijuana. And that, I believe, is fairly true. Somebody verified it. I don't know that that's true anymore because of OxyContin and so forth. But for the moment, let's think about if that is being true. And then this person went on to say, so if you smoke marijuana, you're going to have a 95% chance of being a heroin addict. Is there anything wrong with what this statement? Do you disagree? This is where somebody unmutes and challenges me.
People might disagree on that statement.
Was that Casey?
Yeah.
Casey,
sorry.
could I see your face? I
Yeah.
want to see it. All right. Well, but 95% of heroin addicts, let's see all of your face. I can only see half. Yeah, okay, that's better. 95% of heroin addicts had started on marijuana. That's true. So what's wrong with what I did, with what I said?
It's the complete opposite. So it would the person is saying like wrong facts because
Yeah, what the person did is they flipped the
yeah.
statistic. 95% of heroin addicts did begin with marijuana, but that doesn't mean if you smoke marijuana, you have a 95% chance of becoming a heroin addict. You know, there's a difference, causation. One, you can't flip the causation. Okay, so you want to be careful of things like that. The way people use numbers, they do things like cherry picking the data, and we'll talk more about that later. So just, good hard statistics are great. Just make sure they're true. That's really important. We also have transitions. When we move, we have to signal between when we're moving from one main idea to another. You may have had this happen where you're having a conversation with someone about some topic, and all of a sudden they say something really strange. And then you realize what they've done is they've moved on to another topic. Has that ever happened to you? I think it's happened to most of us. So signal that you're moving. You say, well, while this is happening over here, at this other place, something else was going on. You're transitioning. Or meanwhile, or in some way to distinguish your main ideas from one another. It also helps explain the relationship of one point to another. So, and mostly you're going to use verbal transitions. You're going to use your words. Occasionally, you might use a nonverbal transition, but we'll see. Mostly, it's you may use a gesture or something, but make sure it's clear that you're moving from one point to another and not just extending that first point. In some cases, you might want to preview your ideas. That can increase interest. To do something that you might be interested in, that would be great. You can also control expectations. You can also tell people what you're not going to cover, and that's helpful. Because sometimes I remember going through listening for an hour talk, and there was something I was really wanting to learn, and it was only at the end that this woman said, "No, I'm not really talking about that." And I was very disappointed. So at the end, also, you might want to summarize, remind your audience of the key points of your presentation. And you want to reinforce your conclusion, okay? Because not everyone's going to remember every point of your speech, especially if your speech is longer. And this can all lead up to a call to action. And call to actions will almost every persuasive speech will have a call to action, or at least it should, I think. And you may have call to actions in informational speeches, like, learn more about this, something like that. Okay, any questions?